You'd think being the last house in the neighborhood not in the HOA would give me some kind of immunity, like maybe a sense of freedom or a badge of honor. Nope. Instead, it's like walking around with a big neon sign on my roof that says, "Target acquired, started small like it always does." A flyer tucked into my mailbox with a cheerful, "We'd love to welcome you to the HOA family," which, if you ask me, reads more like, "Join us or face the consequences." I tossed it into the trash as I always did and went on with my life. But then came the friendly comments from my neighbors. "Oh, you're still not in the HOA? How do you manage without our amenities?" "Yeah, Karen, I'm sure your community pool is just one chlorine tablet away from being a luxury resort. And let's not forget about Gary, one of the members of the HOA board who lives next door. He's retired, so judging people's yard work has apparently become his full-time job. You know, he said one Saturday morning while I was watering my plants, 'The HOA has really good landscapers. Your lawn would look so much better if you signed up.' I glanced at my lawn. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't a crime scene either. 'Thanks, Gary,' I said, turning the hose slightly in his direction, 'but I'll manage.' That's how things went for months. The little comments, the sideways glances, the HOA board members accidentally knocking on my door with their amazing offers. Then came the fence debacle. It was an innocent project. My fence had been rotting in a way that made it look like it was auditioning for a haunted house, so I figured I'd replace it. Nothing fancy, just a clean, sturdy wooden fence. But the day it went up, I swear half the HOA showed up like I just built a fortress on the neighborhood playground. Marcy, the HOA president, strutted up my driveway, clipboard in hand, like she was walking into a courtroom. Behind her was Bob, the HOA's treasurer, who always looked like he'd just been told someone touched the thermostat. "Hi there," Marcy said in that voice people use when they're about to ruin your day. "We noticed your new fence." "Great," I said, crossing my arms. "Thanks for noticing." Her smile didn't budge. "It's just that, well, it doesn't conform to the neighborhood aesthetic." I looked at her, then at the fence, then back at her. "It's a fence." "Yes, but our guidelines specify neutral tones. Whites, grays, maybe a soft beige. This," she paused dramatically, "wood is a bit too natural. It's distracting." I stared at her for a long second. "Distracting?" I repeated. "You think my fence is distracting?" Bob, who hadn't said a word until now, cleared his throat. "It's not in harmony with the other fences. You know, it stands out." "Well, Bob," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm, "heaven forbid anyone in this neighborhood stands out." Marcy straightened her clipboard like it was some kind of talisman. "We'd like to offer you some paint samples. Complimentary, of course." I took the samples, flipped through the blandest shades of beige I'd ever seen, and handed them back. "Thanks, but no thanks." Marcy pursed her lips. "Well, we'll have to discuss this at the next board meeting." "Knock yourselves out," I said, shutting the door. A week later, I came home to a letter taped to my door. Not even in an envelope, just taped there like some kind of HOA ransom note. "Dear homeowner, your recent fence installation violates the community standards. We request that you repaint it within 14 days to align with HOA guidelines. Failure to comply may result in fines." Oh, and they'd helpfully attached another set of beige paint samples. How thoughtful. That was the last straw. If they wanted me to paint my fence, fine. I'd paint it. But I wasn't about to spend my weekends staring at shades called desert fog or eggshell dreams. No, I had a better idea. The next morning, I drove to the hardware store and bought every can of brightly colored paint I could find. Red, blue, green, purple, yellow, you name it, I bought it. And then I got to work. By the end of the weekend, my fence was a masterpiece of chaos. Every meter was a different color, like some kind of deranged rainbow. It was glorious. A Technicolor middle finger to the HOA. The reactions were immediate. Gary stopped mid-jog the next morning, his jaw hanging open like a fish out of water. What is this?" he stammered. "It's art, Gary," I said, grinning. "You wouldn't understand." Marcy showed up 2 hours later, clutching her clipboard like it was a life raft. This is completely unacceptable, she sputtered. Oh, come on, Marcy, I said. You said to paint it. You never said how. She pointed her pen at me like she was trying to hex me. This isn't over. I waved her off. I'll be here, Marcy. Anytime you want to talk about my aesthetic choices. For a few days, my psychedelic fence was the hottest topic in the neighborhood. Some people loved it. Kids walking by would stare in awe, and old Mrs. Thompson down the street told me it reminded her of the good old days before everything turned beige. Others, mainly HOA members and their devoted minions, looked like they were developing ulcers just from glancing at it. But then the real fun began. A thick envelope arrived in my mailbox one evening. I didn't even have to open it to know it was from the HOA. I could feel the judgment radiating from the paper. Inside was a formal notice. Dear homeowner, your fence remains in violation of community standards. As you are aware, failure to comply results in a fine of $200 per week. Please remit payment within 10 business days to avoid further penalties. I stared at the letter. Then I reread it. Then I laughed so hard I almost dropped it in my dog's water bowl. A fine? From an HOA I wasn't even a part of? Oh, this was getting better and better. The next day, I decided to pay Marcy and her board of doom a visit. I figured if they were going to try to extort me, the least I could do was watch them squirm in person. The HOA office was in the clubhouse, a place I had never once set foot in, mostly because I enjoyed retaining my will to live. It was the kind of room where fake plants go to die and where the scent of bad coffee mixed with printer ink. Marcy sat at the head of a long table, flanked by Bob and some other unfortunate souls. She folded her hands like some kind of villain about to deliver a monologue. Ah, we were expecting you. Were you? I tossed the letter onto the table. Because I wasn't expecting this. Bob adjusted his glasses. You have an unpaid fine. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. Fun fact, Bob. I'm not in the HO. Silence. Marcy cleared her throat. Well, yes, but you are in the neighborhood, and we enforce standards for the good of the community. So you just fine people who aren't members? Another awkward pause. Bob shuffled some papers, looking anywhere but at me. It's common practice, Marcy finally said. Oh, I'm sure it is. Just like pyramid schemes are a common business model. Marcy's lips pressed into a thin line. If you don't pay, we will have to escalate the matter. Great, I said. Escalate away. But first, I have a question. What exactly happens to all the money from these fines? And that was when I saw it. The tiniest flicker of hesitation in Marcy's expression. Bob suddenly found something fascinating in his coffee cup. The other board members exchanged the kind of looks that screamed, oh crap. Interesting. Very interesting. That night, I got curious. I'd heard rumors before about HOAs misusing funds, but I'd never had a reason to look into it. Now? Well, now I had motivation. HOA budgets and financial reports aren't technically public, but they are available to members. So I did what any rational person in my situation would do. I called up my neighbor, Dave. Dave was an HOA member, but only because he wanted access to the gym. More importantly, Dave owed me big time for helping him move his ridiculous antique couch last summer. Hey, Dave, I said, keeping my voice casual. Think you could get your hands on the HOA's financial records? Dave, bless his heart, didn't even ask why. Sure. Give me a couple of days, and let me tell you what he found was juicy. The HOA collected thousands in fines every year, and a significant chunk of that money was unaccounted for. There were vague expenses like consulting fees, to who? And landscape maintenance, for what? A single flower bed. The best part? A whole section of the budget just disappeared into miscellaneous administrative costs. Translation. Someone was lining their pockets, and I had a pretty damn good idea who. Armed with this new information, I did what any responsible adult would do. I made copies and anonymously delivered them to every single homeowner in the neighborhood. And then I sat back and waited. Took about 4 hours before the neighborhood group chat exploded. Linda H. Why are we paying $5,000 a year for office supplies? Does Marcy print gold leaf documents? James R. Who the hell is getting paid consulting fees? Heather D. We have a $10,000 budget for holiday decorations, but our Christmas lights last year looked like they came from a thrift store dumpster. By the next day, people were calling for a full financial audit. The HOA board was scrambling. Marcy tried to dismiss the accusations as misunderstandings, but nobody was buying it. Then the real bombshell dropped. An anonymous tip, okay, fine, it was me, led to a local journalist getting interested in the story. And as it turned out, this wasn't the first time Marcy had been accused of mismanaging HOA funds. The investigation turned up some interesting facts, like how she had mysteriously upgraded to a brand new car right after the HOA raised its annual dues. Oh, and Bob? Turns out Bob's landscaping company had been getting all the HOA's contracts. Contracts that, shockingly, were way overpriced. Oops. By the end of the week, Marcy had resigned for personal reasons. Bob vanished faster than a free donut at an office meeting. And the rest of the board? They were suddenly very interested in restructuring. And me? Well, I repainted my fence. Not because I had to, just because I could. And this time, I painted it bright, obnoxious gold. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that nothing says screw you quite like a glittering golden fence reminding the world that some rules aren't worth following. With Marcy gone, Bob vanished, and the rest of the HOA board avoiding eye contact with the public, something weird happened. People started treating me like some kind of local hero. At first, it was just the occasional thumbs up from a passing neighbor. Then came the free coffee from Linda for services to the community. Then, before I knew it, there was an actual petition going around to make me the new HOA president. The same HOA I had just burned to the ground. One morning, Heather from across the street showed up at my door with a clipboard. "We need a leader," she said, all serious, like this was some post-apocalyptic wasteland and not a cul-de-sac with too many labradoodles. I stared at her. "Heather, I don't want to be in the HOA. That's why you'd be perfect," she insisted. "You'd make sure it doesn't turn into a dictatorship again." I rubbed my face. "Let me get this straight. You want me to run an HOA, to prevent it from acting like an HOA?" "Yes, absolutely not." Heather narrowed her eyes. "Fine, but at least come to the Freedom Block party this Saturday." "The what?" Turns out, in celebration of our neighborhood finally being free from tyranny, a bunch of neighbors had planned a massive block party. The Freedom Block party was in full swing by the time I showed up. People were laughing, drinking, and letting loose in ways that would have made Marcy spontaneously combust if she were still around. It was hands down the best event this neighborhood had ever seen, which is why I should have known something shady was about to happen. I was mid-bite into a suspiciously good burger when Heather grabbed the mic. "All right, folks, time for the big moment of the night. The vote for our new HOA president." Cheers erupted. I kept chewing unbothered. I wasn't in the HOA. This didn't concern me. Then Heather grinned. "And I think we all know who our first nominee is." Every head turned toward me. I froze, mid-chew. "No," I said, before I had even swallowed. "Absolutely not." "Come on," someone called. "You're the only one we trust." Linda raised her beer. "We need you to keep things fair. No more Marcy nonsense." I put my burger down and wiped my hands very deliberately, so they understood how serious I was. "Guys, you do realize that to be HOA president, I would have to actually join the HOA, right?" Silence. Then a few muttered, "Oh, and wait, really?" I sighed. "Yes, that's how it works. And there is no way I'm doing that." Heather groaned. "But, no." Linda sighed. "Fine. Who else wants to do it?" That's when someone threw out a new name. Dave. Dave, the guy who only joined the HOA for gym access. The guy who never cared about politics, barely showed up to meetings, and just wanted to be left alone. And that's how, 5 minutes later, Dave was unanimously elected as HOA president. His victory speech? Yeah, okay, I guess. The crowd erupted in cheers. Under Dave's leadership, which mostly consisted of doing nothing, the HOA technically existed, but in the most bare minimum way possible. No pointless fines. No clipboard patrols. No beige paint regulations. People did almost whatever they wanted, and somehow the neighborhood didn't collapse into anarchy. Marcy's old cronies either moved away or learned to keep their opinions to themselves. Bob, still missing in action, probably faking his own death in a non-extradition country. And me, I kept my glorious golden fence. I kept my freedom. And most importantly, I stayed HOA free.